Instead of trying to say everything all at once through like all the different mediums that are available to you, because I think that can end up being more confusing as well. Like I think we definitely need to explore and find what we are interested in, but we don't have to do all of the things because there's someone else out there doing it too, and it's fine, you know.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to the discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. I'm your host, Aaron S., and today's episode is the first part of a two-part conversation with the amazing artist, Crystel Pereira. Crystel is a fine artist based in Montreal, Canada, whose work examines our relationship to the landscape around us. Exploring themes such as climate change, Crystel often uses oil paints to depict scenes that show us how we are changing and damaging the world we live in. I'll start where I start with everybody. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became an artist.
Sure. Well, I'm a visual artist from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and I started painting a little over 4 years ago. I was actually an osteopath before I started making art. So that's, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a form of manual therapy. So kind of like a physical therapist. So I worked with people doing manual therapy, and I actually started painting while I was studying to be an osteo. And it was just something that I quickly became really obsessed with and then started doing a lot. And it was during the pandemic actually that I started painting full time, because I was already in art school part-time, but like more kind of for fun while I was working. And the clinic that I was working at during the pandemic closed down in the first 3 months, where I don't know what lockdown looked like for you guys, but over here, everything closed for 3 months. And then there was just nothing open and everyone had to stay at home. We had a curfew. It was really intense. And I started just painting every day and talking to friends online while painting. And it just became like a very big part of my life. And then the clinic, since it was closed, I stopped working there, and then I just never went back, kind of.
That's great.
So I've been doing that full time since then, and now I can actually live off of that, and have things planned in regards to like my painting career. So I'm very lucky to be able to do that.
So I'm actually quite curious. Like, do you feel that like had the pandemic never happened, do you think you would be a full-time artist now?
It was my plan to do that, but like on a more long-term timeline, because I don't think I would have ever felt comfortable quitting my job that was, like safe and well paid and that I had studied to do, and until I had something like kind of sure or more stable. Whereas when the pandemic started, I wasn't at a point in my painting where I felt comfortable with it, or where I would have chosen to do that full time and like made that leap. But I just kind of did it, and then things started working anyway. And and then I started, I was doing art school before, but part-time, and then I was doing it full-time during the pandemic. And then I recently graduated. Well, recently, not so recently anymore. It's been exactly 1 year actually. So I graduated from art school last year, and then just kind of never went back to work as a manual therapist.
So like, I find that really fascinating, because I speak to a lot of artists who are part-time that want to be full-time artists. And I always say to them, like, being a full-time artist is great, but there's a lot of responsibility and a lot of hard work for you to be a full-time artist. It's not the illusion that you're going to be just sitting in your studio painting every day, because actually being a full-time artist, 10% of that is actually painting, 90% is admin. I'm kind of like,
I don't know the exact percentage of what is what, but I was surprised by how much administrative stuff there was to do with it. And especially in the beginning, like I didn't have a website. I didn't have, any of that. I hadn't written a biography. I hadn't written an artist statement or any of that. I had never applied to shows. I hadn't done all of that. And so I was kind of just learning as I was doing it. And then, I just thought, oh, well, why not do this next step, and why not push it and see what happens? And
actually, can you talk about some of the kind of different hats you have to wear as a full-time artist?
Well, you're kind of like doing 6 different jobs, I think, or maybe not 6, but you have to be able to document your work. So photography, and now with, everything going towards a more like video thing, like I haven't done that yet, but I plan on kind of dabbling in trying to make like time lapse and things like that as well. So documenting is a big part of it, because a lot of what you do as an artist ends up online, or is consumed digitally online. So you have to present a good version of it. Otherwise, there's also a lot of writing about your work that I hadn't anticipated being
Yeah.
such a big thing. But every show that I've applied to, every grant that I've applied to has involved a lot of writing. For example, currently I have a grant that allows me to just paint full time and do a lot of research and creation. But for that, I had to write a 15-page document with a budget, a timeline, biography, a complete description of the project that I wanted to do. So even before you start painting, before you start any of that, you have to apply for this, and then you have to already have written out what you plan on doing with it and how you're going to go about doing it. So there's definitely a lot more planning, especially for someone who's more like last minute and who doesn't necessarily, plan projects 6 months in advance, because you have to for these sorts of things. You have to write it up, and you can't submit it like the day before the deadline, because you won't get an answer for 4 months. So depending on if you do get a positive answer, then you're going to get those funds and you're going to be able to start the project. But you have to definitely plan a lot more in advance.
See, that's crazy. But that's also really interesting, because at some point in the future, probably the very far future, like doing kind of like grants, giving artists grants is something that I would love to do. I think it'd be so helpful, because I think any kind of money that kind of goes into the arts is going to be the best thing ever. So I'm actually really intrigued with that concept. It's something that I've been thinking about. Don't know what I'm thinking about now. I don't have the finances, but it's something that I would love to do in the future, because I think, if you could pay like an artist rent for a year, something like that, I think that would be super beneficial to like help them create. Because I think the biggest obstacle for artists is time. Like, you need the time to create. And I guess a good question from that would be like, what is the biggest challenge of being an artist for you?
I think there's a lot of different ones, and I think according to the artist's personality, they're going to take up more or less space for them in terms of being obstacles. But definitely time, money, space, and otherwise just more believing in what you do and believing in yourself and persevering with it as well, because it's easy to doubt what you're doing, especially when we have access to see so much interesting art online, and we could just access it and just see like all this amazing stuff, and we get to feel like everything's been done, or everything's been done better by someone else. So why am I doing it? And so I think just like having that confidence of knowing, like, even if you made a terrible painting today and the day before and the day before that, and you feel like you're not confident with your stuff, like just knowing that if you keep at it for a certain number of years, that you will get to a point with it where you're satisfied with it. But like, I can't say that I'm there yet with my work in terms of like being satisfied with it, but I know that if I stick with it and keep working towards it, I will get to that point. So I think that was the hardest part for me, to like overcome those temporary like feelings of I don't like my work, or even within the same painting, even if I end up liking the end result, there's always an ugly stage of a painting where you're applying things and you're like, what am I doing with my life? This is horrible. Like, I'm so glad no one is seeing this right now. And then you just have to push through that and get to a point where you're like, okay, it wasn't so bad. I had to like set the stage for this painting to become what it is later on. But there's always that stage where you're just like, well, I should become a plumber,
Oh, that's my life every day. I'm always like, what am I doing with my life? Why do I do this? Like, it's I
Exactly.
think it's because being an artist is so uncertain, and there's no guarantee of anything. There's no guarantee your work will be seen by anybody. There's no guarantee people will like it. There's no guarantee of success. There's no guarantee of financial reward. There's just no guarantee, which is actually why I like talking to artists. Somebody asked me this the other day. I should probably know who to ask me, because I can't remember. But somebody asked me the other day, like, why do I like talking to artists? And I said, because the career is so, and that's it. Mark Thompson, a really cool artist. I'll send you his work if you don't know his work already. That's who asked me.
Yeah.
Because we had a Zoom call. How did I forget that? But he asked me like, why do I interview artists? And I said, because art is so uncertain, and I feel like art's so important and it's around us everywhere. But I feel like for me, I don't see people really promoting it as much as it should be promoted, in my opinion. And I'm kind of just actually curious, like, do you think that society undervalues art?
Before I answer that, I'd like to go back on like the uncertainty part of it, because I think that's definitely a huge part of it. And like, there's, like, navigating in all this uncertainty is liberating, but also terrifying, because anything can be done, anything is possible. And so you have to choose what you do, and then you have to do it. And so there's like a big part of already like going back to like just creating what you want to do and navigating that uncertainty, and like the blank page being at once like liberating and terrifying. So that's something that I wanted to mention about that. And sorry, what was the other question? You said something about if art was undervalued. I think it can be. I think it depends a lot on I mean, I can only speak to my experience living where I live with like access to, the public funding and opportunities that I get here. I think there are quite a lot of opportunities if you go looking for them, but there's also a lot of competition or a lot of other people that are doing very interesting work as well and who, absolutely deserve an opportunity to show it as well. So I think you have to kind of be willing to look for opportunities, promote yourself in a way, and have that confidence to, show your stuff and say like, yes, I think this is worthy of being shown or of being valued. And so I think that's like maybe the hard part where a lot of artists will wait to be discovered or wait for that, like elusive gallery to come knocking, and that's not necessarily how it works, or at least not anymore. There's not that same relationship to that anymore.
I think, although we'll get into it much later, I think social media doesn't really help necessarily, because I feel like we all kind of think, or we always hope in the back of our minds that somehow we'll suddenly be discovered on social media and everything will increase in terms of our views and our likes and our followers, and that provide us loads of opportunities, when actually you really have to make, as you said yourself, you really have to make the opportunities happen for yourself. And it's crazy to me because I know artists who are extremely like nose to the ground, have gallery shows all the time, always constantly working, yet their work still isn't seen by that many people. And it kind of makes me think that it's already about kind of like the way you show your work and how you come across and how you're perceived. And actually, a question for you now, which I was going to ask you much later, but now is probably the best way it fits into the conversation. Quick aside, I sent you notes, but the order never goes to plan.
No worries.
I jump around all the time, just so you know. But a question actually would be good to ask you is from a friend of mine called Ryan Dean Has, and I asked this in I think every interview now at this point. And we were talking ages ago about the idea of which is more important, the skill of the artist or the personality of the artist.
I personally hope that it's more the skill of the artist, but I'm not sure. I think it's probably a combination of that. And I think a lot of, like the more traditional art world with galleries and all that is also based on the personality of the artist and who they know and their contacts and all that. But I think there has to be substance behind that. There has to be something worthy of looking at and talking about, and something that brings something as well, and not just like, oh, well, this person is very charismatic and knows the right people, so they're gonna succeed in this. Or at least I hope that's not like the entire answer, because I'm really not good at the whole like networking aspect of it. I wish I could just not do it and like send an actor into the world who does all that, and I just like stay in the shadows and paint. But unfortunately, that's not how it works.
I do kind of wonder if there is a niche there where somebody could fill that gap, because I feel like so many artists, and I feel bad because I always say so many artists, I always reference people I talk to, but I talk to a lot of artists every day. But there's a kind of case of like, so many artists want to do the same thing. Like people don't want to have to promote themselves. They don't want to have to attend gallery shows necessarily. They don't want to have to post on social media necessarily. They don't have to necessarily be out in the limelight. They want to just be in their studios, in their houses, creating work and kind of just, actually focusing on their craft, not the 90% of the admin. And I'm kind of wondering, like, maybe there's a niche there for someone to fill that gap, or maybe like some kind of artist manager role could be filled. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I know that there are artist managers, but I don't think, like, what I had in mind was, I wish that there was like, maybe it could be an art performance, but like an actor who would pretend to be me and go to all of these events and be very charismatic and meet people and pretend it's their work and talk about it, and I would coach them. But but I do know that there are artist managers, but they won't do this.
Hey, you could hire someone to do that. It could work. In the right way, it could actually work. Or it could just be a sense of like, maybe figuring out how you're comfortable talking about your work and the way in which you want your work to be seen, and kind of have your work displayed somewhere where you feel comfortable enough to talk about it, that you're true, that you don't feel kind of like that you have to have somebody else to replace you, because at the end of the day, like, we want to hear from you. You're the one who creates it.
Exactly. And like, I say this, but I really sincerely enjoyed, for example, at my exhibition, speaking to everyone who was there and seeing their reaction to my work, and just watching them walk around the room and look at things, and seeing how they engage with the art as well. And that's something that I would lose if I was just like a recluse, getting progressively weirder, staying alone at home and like petting my cats. Although
that does sound like the ideal life, I'm not gonna lie. I'm just
Yeah.
like, can I just sit in my room, drink tea, eat biscuits, and just talk to artists? Can I just do that in my life? That'd be perfect. You know, one can
Mhm.
hope.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so I actually wanted to kind of go back slightly to the idea of art education because, as
Mhm.
you just said, you graduated last year. Congratulations on that. That is absolutely
Thank
wonderful.
you.
But I just wanted to know, like, what was your experience of art education like, and is it
Mhm.
something that you would suggest or recommend to the artists?
Mhm. Well, I think everyone's experience with that is going to be different. And I'm very lucky to live in a province where art education is very inexpensive, or like education in general is very inexpensive. So it wasn't like a big deal for me to go back to school and to do a bachelor's degree, because it wasn't costing me, for example, $100,000 like it would
Yeah.
in the US, or I'm not sure what the education system is like in the UK, but I'm assuming it would be a little bit more costly as well.
It cost you about £10,000 maybe.
Okay, so not as bad as
No,
100,000, but still,
it's not
no,
100,000. No, like
no.
if that was the case, nobody would ever have any education ever here.
No, well, I definitely wouldn't if that had been the case. But yeah, given that it was like such a low risk decision, it was definitely easier for me to take that decision and to go there. And yeah, as I mentioned, I personally really enjoyed it. I was also going back to it as an adult who already had studied before and who already had a career, quote unquote. But yeah, so I think that took a lot of the stress away from being in school, because I had classmates who were 18 and 19, and who were so stressed about everything, and who were just who'd have panic attacks with the critiques that we would have in class. And for me, it was just like, well, I'm just talking about my art to a group of people, and I'm hoping to get some insightful comments, or just to get some critique, or to get better at this. So yeah, I think there's definitely something to there's something to be had from an art education. I don't think it's mandatory, and I don't think that everyone has to do this in order to become an artist. And even if they want to become a professional artist, I don't think it's necessary. Some places will ask that you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in order to show your work there, or in order to collaborate with them, but that's pretty rare, I find, from applying to different things. I've seen like a couple of places that ask this, but not all that many. And I think that ultimately we're all kind of self-taught in a way, because even within a
Yeah.
specific framework or structure, you're only going to learn to the extent that you're curious and willing to learn. And no one is ever really self-taught anyway. It's just always like a combination of where you get your sources. And with access to the internet nowadays, you can have so much interesting information, like in terms of mediums, or in terms of just learning anything that you want to learn about art. You can look it up, you will find videos of people showing you specific techniques or specific things. And there's so many resources out there if you're willing to go out and look for them. So that's why I say that no one is self-taught. It's just a matter of like how you go get the
Yeah.
information, how you integrate it, and what you do with it.
Have you ever thought about teaching?
I did teach actually all of last year. Yeah, I taught adults living with physical disabilities.
Oh wow.
So it was a really fun experience. It was a very small group, though. I think it was about 6 students.
Okay.
And so it was nice, because I got to know everyone really intimately, because it was a class over a 1 year period where we would see
Oh
each other
wow.
every
Yeah.
week. Mhm. Yeah, and I really
Wow.
enjoyed that.
Would you ever consider doing like a Skillshare course or something like that?
Perhaps, but I think I would have to feel like I developed something unique or specific that I would be able to bring, because I think there's already a lot of good teachers out there, and there's already a lot of good courses that'll teach you. I'm mostly interested in oil painting, so there's already a lot of oil painting introductory courses and all that out there. So I don't know what more I could bring currently, but I think in a couple of years I would be more interested in, if I develop specific things in teaching that. Yeah.
What about the pre-production of an image? Maybe isn't that something you can teach?
hmm Yeah, like all the work that goes into
Yeah.
beforehand. Yeah. I think I'm not sure how much interest. Well, no, there would probably be interest for that, but I'm just not sure how many people know that they would be interested in it. Uh,
Only because, like, for me, at this moment in time, I'm very interested in pre-production of
mhm,
images and art because I feel like that's a huge part of the creative process which you don't really see that often. And obviously, I
mhm.
understand it can be a very elusive one because you don't really know what you're creating sometimes. But I'm
True.
kind of just really interested, like, how somebody gets from like the initial concept in their mind to having it down on a physical
hmm
surface. And I'm
Yeah.
always really interested because it can go anywhere,
hmm
but it ends up going somewhere.
That's true. And it usually I think it depends on the people, but for me, it usually ends up only kind of vaguely resembling the initial idea or the initial plan. I can tell you maybe a little bit personally how I go about approaching
absolutely.
creating an image. There's usually some, hang on, no, I'm not going to show you my sketchbook because that's not going to translate well for audio, but basically I usually start with just little like thumbnail sketches where I just kind of figure out where things would be placed on it. And I usually start from, like, I'll mentally just have an image or an idea or something that I want to create, and then I'll go about trying to create a composition with that, or just seeing like, just specific like color areas or things that I would want to show. And then from there, I'll test out different iterations of that thing until I feel like I have something that I would want to translate to a bigger surface. And then I try that. I used to be more like, I would basically, when I was learning, I would find an image that I found interesting and then I would just recreate that image. But now I'm trying to go beyond that and to incorporate different things. And if I do use photography as reference for my work now, it'll be many different images and not just one. And I'll try to work a little bit more with composition ideas that aren't just like recreating the original image.
I've just wrote down here, there's an artist I interviewed quite recently. Well, no, I interviewed her quite a while ago, but her interviews just came out, and she does the same thing in terms of like, her name's Helena Artbook, and
Okay.
she creates these really, really cool, beautiful images of women, like these really amazing kind of very just feminine, very kind of like very, very like feminine, divine, very like big eyes. She has a very interesting aesthetic to her work, but she creates them using various different images combined. And
Okay.
I'm going to send you her work, and I'll send her work to you and your
Okay.
work to her, and hopefully we can have a conversation about that, because it could be really interesting. Because
Yeah.
one thing I love to do is connect people. I'm like, okay, these people have similar like creative processes. Maybe they could discuss it and kind of get ideas and bounce ideas for each other. Granted, your subject matter is very different. That could also be very interesting to consider.
Yeah.
If you want me to, of course.
Yeah, for sure.
I've just added her onto the list that I'm going to send you. Actually, I kind of jumped ahead slightly, but just for those who have not seen it, can you just describe your work?
Sure. So I mostly do, currently I'm doing large scale contemporary landscape paintings in oil. So they're generally pretty colorful. What else could I say about it? Well, there's usually some sort of like man-made elements incorporated in them or something else that will disrupt the image in a way. It's kind of hard to say at this point because I feel like my work is changing currently, where I'm going more towards doing like kind of composite images or kind of doing more complex compositions where I'm incorporating more things in them. But yeah, basically, like if I had to describe it in a very concise manner, I would say like landscape paintings, kind of colorful, kind of weird at times.
So are there any particular key themes that you look at in your work?
Well, I've become more interested in how to talk about like the environmental crisis through art. And that's just a thing that's kind of happened in the past year in my work, I would say, where before that I was more focused on learning how to paint, how to use my materials, how to. And I think I was trying to ask myself what was important for me as a person and as an artist, and how I could incorporate that into my practice. So yeah, I think I've been trying to find a way to talk about that through painting. And I'm still kind of toying with, is it important to create beautiful images, or is it important to address things in a more like literal way, but without it being too literal? Because I don't know, I don't want to just like paint things on fire and be like, hey, everything is horrible and the planet's dying. There still has to be like some art to it.
Because what I like about your work, and the thing that I'm really kind of curious about, is this idea that your work actually has a deeper meaning. It's not just an aesthetically pleasing image. It's not just, oh, this is a really interesting white painted landscape. It's like, oh, this actually means something. There's actually a reason for this to be created. And I'm kind of just curious, like, why is art the right medium to use to promote or to kind of talk about this kind of message?
Well, I think for me, I tend to think more in terms of images or feelings or ideas. And I think that painting can definitely communicate that in a way that I find satisfying. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not going to be writing any books on the subject. It just seems like to me the best way to communicate these feelings and ideas is through making an image that speaks to me and hopefully speaks to others as well. Yeah, so I think that's why for me it's a good medium for that. But I know that some people will be able to speak about the same subjects way more eloquently in words, and that'll be, for them the best way to communicate it. But there's no one way to talk about something, and there's no one right way to do something. So I think like just having like this plurality of voices describing the same or similar things, but in different mediums or in different ways is just going to enrich the conversation.
I know you predominantly paint landscapes, but you also paint other imagery as well. But just on the concept of landscapes in a minute, like why are landscapes important to you though? Like why is looking at the environment around us important?
Well, I think it can definitely help to bring our awareness to our physical surroundings and to kind of wonder about our place in our surroundings as well. And I think we went from seeing nature as something that was something to be feared, something inexplicable, to something that was then to be tamed and studied and understood, but also, bought, sold, exploited. And I think that now there's kind of this turning point where we're going more towards seeing nature as something to be respected, and also seeing nature as something that we are a part of and not just something that we are exterior to. And I think that like shift in perspective is very important, because I think in order to create changes that will help protect the environment, we have to see ourselves as being part of the environment. So whether we're in a rural setting or in an urban setting, like just to see that nature is everywhere and that we are part of it as well. So
So that's actually a really interesting point, because you just said that about buying and selling like nature. I just wrote down here, land is a commodity. And it's like, that's a concept that obviously I'm very aware of, but it's not that I haven't really thought about. And now you just said that, I've just thought, oh, actually, I should create like a photo series based on that. That'd be really interesting. So thank you very much. And also, it's kind of really interesting because this idea of like you're capturing, because actually, the one cool thing about landscape, and it's kind of it's a weird confession. Probably should be mentioning this by but it's weird because like probably about 5-6 years ago, maybe, I actually really didn't like landscapes. I thought landscapes were really boring. I thought landscapes and art were just kind of overdone. Whereas now I absolutely love seeing images of landscapes. I think it's actually probably one of the most exciting subjects you can draw, because really you're documenting the world around you. And, and in a year's time, in 6 months' time, in 10 years' time, it will never be like that again.
Exactly.
So I guess
and
in many ways,
it's
you're
funny
a
what you say about
as well as a painter.
not enjoying landscapes, because when I started painting, I was drawn to it, but I was also worried about having my work be more contemporary or important or speaking of something more relevant. And so it felt like landscape was this outdated subject matter. And I kind of shied away from it for like, I would say the first year, or, I had a different relationship to it, but now I definitely don't feel that it's outdated or that it doesn't have its place. And I think it's more relevant than ever now to be painting landscapes with what we know about the state of the world and where things are going.
See, that's actually I'm gonna say it's a lot in this interview, but that's a really good consideration, because you're very right. Because when you think of art, at least when I think of art, I think not automatically, but the idea of portraits in the human form, the human condition, like that's a huge subject that so many people look at. And it kind of seems like sometimes that's very much eclipsed. Like landscape painting is or just landscapes in general, are very much eclipsed by the idea of figurative work in the human condition, because one could argue that we can relate to figures more because we can see ourselves in images of other people. But then I also feel like we can very much consider the human condition by looking at landscapes also. And I think you're right. I think there is actually not a trend, because I don't think it's really a trend, but there's definitely like a rise in the way that the landscape has now been portrayed through art in this contemporary era, I think. And also with technology as well, I think it's kind of more important than ever to document the world around us, really.
Yeah. And just in terms of like how climate change has been portrayed in the media since, I think it's 2019, there's been a 75% increase in the amount of times that we hear about climate change in the news. And so I think it's become this, like, I don't think that things have changed dramatically since 2019, but just like the way that we hear about it and the frequency at which we hear about it has changed our relationship to these things. And so I think people have just become kind of hyper aware of how we're impacting the planet. And I think that artists being kind of sensitive to this and what's going on around them in the world have maybe turned more towards landscape or things dealing with nature because of this shift in perspective.
I actually kind of wanted to ask the question then, and it's not something I put on the notes, I've just typed it up, but the idea of like, if your work is about something like climate change or kind of just the economy, like how do you kind of make sure that your work is presented as authentic rather than kind of jumping on a trend?
Well, I think that will have a lot to do with your intention. I think that, no matter how much we pile things on top of our intention, like it still shows through in the end product. So if you're coming from a place of like sincerely wanting to express something about these questions, I think that's going to come through. Whereas if you're, like either visually or conceptually copying someone, I think that's also going to come through as well. So I think just by reflecting on these things and by trying to find a personal way to express that, I think it's always going to read as being sincere, even if it's something that just happens to currently be a popular subject or, happens to be doing well in the art world.
But do you think that it'll be noticed? Let's say you jump on a trend of what's trendy at the minute. Let's say AI art, for instance, which is really quite trendy. Like, let's say you jumped on that trend. Do you think that other artists will understand that you're jumping on a trend, or do you think the general public will understand you're jumping on a trend?
I'm not sure about that. It's kind of hard to say. Like, I feel it could be interpreted either way, but I think if you get to a certain point as an artist where you have a certain voice or style, no matter the way that you interpret it afterwards, it's still going to show through in that. So maybe that's a part of the answer, but I'm not sure. I personally have just been kind of going towards things that I'm interested in and trying to go as far as I can in that. So it's hard for me to speak to trends exactly because I just feel like I've been on this journey of like trying to find what exactly I want to do and what I want to say with my art. And I feel like I'm, at the beginning of discovering what it is, and I'm just pursuing that. So I haven't been too concerned with how it comes across or how it's perceived, but I know that, it is viewed and perceived in a certain way, but I don't have control over that either way. So I think I'm just going to try to be as honest as I can with it and try to push as far as I can with my personal vision and, let other people perceive it the way that they will, because I can't control that.
And how hard is it to actually kind of find your artistic voice?
Well, I think that it varies a lot. Like some people start out and they already have a very specific either style or message or something that's like super visible in their work or super present. That wasn't the case for me. I feel like I started from a place of just wanting to know how to use my tools and like wanting to experiment with a lot of things. And so I feel like I did a lot of different, very disparate things at first where it was not clear to me or probably to others where I was going with it. And that was fine too. Like you have to let yourself explore things at first and go through all those, phases or experiments. And, like I went through a little portrait phase and it just helped me realize that I don't care for portraits. And I can appreciate people who do it well, but I personally have no interest in doing this or like working with the human figure. A lot of people think that because I was a manual therapist and because I studied anatomy for 6 years that I'm going to have an interest towards this or that I'll have a certain facility with that in art. But in honesty, I have no interest in that whatsoever. Like it's just, if anything, it has made me less interested in this as a subject or as a
that's really fascinating though, I think, because it's kind of like, you're right, people will assume that you're going to be a certain way or be disposed to a certain way, but you're not. And I think that's kind of interesting because that means you look at your work very much from, and I liked what you said earlier actually, in terms of like you're creating for yourself. Because I think it can be very, very easy to get caught up in creating work for other people. And I think, again, we'll talk about this later, but social media also plays a huge role in that in terms of like, feeling like you have to pander to the algorithm or you have to create work that is going to be shareable or is going to be popular. And I'm kind of just curious at like, how do you know that your work is genuinely yours?
Well, I think it's just a feeling that you have where you're satisfied with a piece, regardless of how it's received or how it's interpreted. I think it's just like this feeling of having succeeded in depicting something that's important to you. And I think that by going into something that's really deeply personal, that we get to reach something that is universal in the way that it can impact people. But I think that by trying to go universal, you will never find the personal and that you won't even get the universal because you're just going to be trying to jump on trends, but if there's a trend, it means that it's already there and you're kind of hopping onto it late because it's already visible and you see it, and then you try to emulate it or jump on that, if you will. Whereas if you're just kind of following your little inner thread, and like no matter how tangled it can be, you're still following something that makes sense and that has like well, for lack of a better word, a thread.
Yeah.
And so you're still following this thing that makes sense, just even if it doesn't make sense exteriorly to you, it makes sense. And there's going to be something that that you're going to find at throughout the process, and hopefully at the end as well, but mostly like throughout the process.
So I want to talk to you about different mediums because you're predominantly a painter, but you also dabble with sculpture and three-dimensional work. So what kind of led to you figuring out these are kind of the mediums that you like to explore?
Well, I started with oil painting because I had always been fascinated with it. And when I went to museums, it was always the things that I was drawn to. And so I started with that. And I feel like I, hit upon the right medium when I started because I really love it. And I've tried other things since, and I just always tend to go back to oil painting. But in terms of the 3D work that I've been doing lately, that was, it was I was doing that in order to create a body of work in paint as well. So it wasn't sculpture for sculpture's sake. Maybe eventually I will do things that are 3D and that will just be presented, in and of themselves. But I was interested in trying to see how I could use a physical object as a reference or as a starting point for paintings or for a series of paintings. So I was just creating this little world with like sculptures and living plants and a bunch of different things like that would then be used as references for paintings. So I think in terms of like 3D work, that's the extent of my interest towards it for now. But I really do like the idea of creating a world or creating a little maquette or diorama that I then paint from.
Yeah, because you posted a while back, it was like this three-dimensional piece of work, and it had like the sides, and it had like different sides, and I was really amazed by it because I hadn't seen anything like it. And not just that, it's fascinating because, as you've just said, like being an artist is to create your own world. And it's really interesting when you take the world you've created and put it into the world we exist in. There's something really kind of intriguing about the idea of displacement and this idea of like reality, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I love to always ask artists in every interview about reality. And it's kind of like, so do you consider the reality in the work you create to be of the world we live in, or is it its own reality that you're creating?
I think it varies quite a bit, but like if you think of the painter as a narrator, in realistic paintings, we will kind of assume that the narrator is telling us something that is real or that exists or is pointing to something real. But in my recent exhibition, I was toying with the idea of being an unreliable narrator. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept, but like in literature or in cinema, it's basically like a narrator that is telling you something, but you're not sure if you can trust them. You're not sure if they're really telling you the truth or if they're kind of leading you along into something that doesn't exist. So I wanted to create a body of work where I was the narrator, but the people looking at my work couldn't really be sure if what I was telling them was true or not, because I was painting things that were real, but that were kind of really off in the scale, or that had something a little strange or worrying in it. And so I was interested in doing that.
And this is disturbing strangeness.
Yeah, exactly.
So I actually wanted to ask about the title. I'm assuming you saw the question, or like the kind of the thing I wrote. So like, where did the title come from? And kind of like, is the title, because I wrote here, like disturbing strangeness, as in, do you mean like, are you disturbing the idea of strangeness, or is the strangeness disturbing? Because I really love the ambiguity in the title. I think it's so interesting.
Well, it's from actually the German word unheimlich, that I'm not pronouncing correctly, but anyway, it means like disturbing strangeness or inquiétante étrangeté in French. So it's the feeling that something is at once familiar and strange. So this experience of something as kind of mysterious, but also creepy, but also familiar. So for example, if you're walking into your childhood bedroom and it feels very familiar, but then there's like certain elements that you don't recognize and something starts to feel strange. So it's kind of a thing that is familiar, but also unsettling. So I was trying to create a world where things were familiar because it was elements that you are familiar with, like for example, mushrooms, plants, a bulldozer, like different little toy trucks that were in the landscape as well, but just in ways that made no sense whatsoever. Like the scale was super off for all of these things, and they shouldn't really necessarily be interacting in the same image, but they were able to interact because I created this physical world in which they all coexisted, but just in a kind of strange way.
That's so fascinating. And this whole kind of idea of it's almost in a way, even though it's not quite, it's almost adjacent to, I'd say, like the idea of liminal space and the idea like you're going somewhere where you kind of vaguely know, but also you have no idea what it is. And also the sense of like deja vu, where you're experiencing something that you feel like you've been there before, but you haven't.
Yeah, I think deja vu is a form of unheimlich, or like uncanny. Yeah, but there's also the jamais vu, which is which literally would mean never seen. So it's, for example, if you see something that you've seen every day, but suddenly you see it with new eyes as if you had never seen it. And so this thing that is super familiar to you, and you're suddenly like, wow, has this just been like this the whole time and I haven't seen it? Or if, I don't know if you've ever had this where like you look at the spelling of a word and you're like, that's how you spell this? And I've been writing this my whole life, and it seems so weird that I would put these letters in this in this sequence, but that's how it is. And you get like that sense of strangeness from something so familiar.
I tell you what I get, which is bizarre, and I don't know how common this is, if it's very common, but I always get a feeling of, and I do this a lot at work because I work in a hardware store, so I'm on a timber saw, so I cut wood for people and stuff like that, and I get a lot when I'm on there, which is probably quite concerning. But this idea of like you kind of zone out and kind of remember yourself, if that makes sense. Like you kind of remember like you're currently here doing this moment in time. I don't know if that's common or not, or that should be concerning, but
yeah, kind of like this outside view of yourself, right?
Yeah, it's weird. It happens quite often, and I think maybe I should figure that out. But it's kind of like a sense of you kind of just don't really realize you kind of like you. How can I explain it without sounding absolutely strange? It's almost like you forget you exist, and then you suddenly remember you exist, or like you're suddenly very, very like what's the right word for it? But you're very present,
like aware.
Like you're very present, like that you're currently doing this at this moment in time, and you're the one doing it. I don't know. Not that has anything to do with what we're talking about, but I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, but I get that. And I don't know if there's a word for that, but I've experienced that too, just that feeling of like suddenly being like very aware of that moment and what you're doing it, and just how kind of absurd it can be that you exist as a human on this planet doing this task. And
it's bizarre. It happens at work as well, so I think I should be concerned about that. But
well, especially if you're handling like a saw near your fingers, you should probably be careful.
No, it's not the kind of thing you can cut your hand off unless you're literally cutting your hand off. So it's fine.
Okay.
But it's just, I don't know. It's a weird like sensation because you just kind of, it's just like you remind yourself you exist. It's bizarre. I don't know. It's something that I should Google actually. The sense of displacement, I think. Absolutely. I mean, who needs doctors when we've got Google now? Who needs anything when we've got Google nowadays? Really. I was going to say who needs parents, but I mean, that's a whole different matter. So actually, I want to kind of go back slightly and kind of ask you, like, what do you look for in a landscape when you're painting?
Well, in terms of like purely aesthetic concerns, there's definitely, like a specific composition or like certain lines or things that will lead you into it, or just create something that's compositionally interesting. Otherwise, maybe a color palette. But I think these things happen kind of unconsciously when you're looking at a landscape, because for me, it's more like it'll strike me, or I'll feel something emotionally from it and then want to get into it. But then if I start to analyze why that particular thing was of interest to me, then I'll start realizing, okay, there's this nice contrast of light and dark values, or there's this nice composition, or there's like more formal aspects to it that like impact you in a way. And I think in terms of a painting as well, there's these things that act upon us in a more subtle way. Like we tend to credit colors for everything that a painting does for us, like emotionally, but I think that the value structure is going to be one of the main things that really draws you in, like how well you handle the light and darks and like the everything in between, and afterwards how you arrange the composition and how you place everything on there. And I'm still figuring all of that out, but I think I think I've realized lately that that's one of the things that really draws you to something and kind of captivates you. And it's, afterwards that the details come in. But I think if you start to think of an image in terms of the details first, and then you neglect like the composition and the values and all that, like that makes for a kind of poor image in the end. But so I think that, but also, I don't know, like landscapes for me were definitely something where, at first it was related to, like you get somewhere at the end of a hike and there's this like beautiful view and you're in front of it and then you feel kind of apart from it and you want to like hang on to it.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a part of landscape painting that like wants to hang on to the feeling of that moment, or like the something, that can't really be put into words when you're in front of like these vast expanses or in front of something specific like that.
So why is it about like wide open spaces, do you think, that you're intrigued by?
I'm not sure. Well, I think it comes back to like our relationship to nature and trying to see myself as part of it and not exterior to it. So, like something, I think wide open spaces are more, it's easier to feel like you're part of something bigger if you're in those spaces and you like really let yourself feel the moment in that.
But it's also interesting because I always feel like if I go to the seaside, for instance, and I look at the ocean, I always feel very
Mm-hmm.
small as well. It makes you kind of
Yeah.
rethink about your own life in terms of like the
Mm-hmm.
fact that you're, really ironically like a drop in the ocean, like, your life is so tiny. And that
Mm-hmm.
actually it always makes me come back thinking like nothing really matters in a
Mm-hmm.
slightly
But in
cynical
a good
way.
way.
Slightly cynical, but in a good way, yes. It's kind of
Yeah.
like, you kind of realize, actually, things could be very different. They could be,
Mm-hmm.
very much the same. It's, I don't know. I think there's something about, because I'm very much in my own work, very interested at the minute, especially in kind of wide open spaces, the idea of just kind of just space in general and the way in which we have both commodified it and also the way in which we use it, or how
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of almost held prisoner, like, where we have buildings, or the idea of property, the idea of
Yeah.
trespassing and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. There's something I'm also very interested in terms of like the landscape itself, which is
Mm-hmm.
funny.
But that idea of feeling small in front of something vast, I think, is very important because, we're definitely in a society of where we think that humans are kind of superior to things and everything is centered around us, our needs and all that. So I think to be able to have those experiences where we're in front of something bigger than us and part of something bigger than us is super important, because if it helps us change our relationship to the natural world and to what we are calling resources instead of just like a forest, for example, like I think that can be very helpful in how we treat it or how we
Yeah.
look to protect it in a way as well. Because I think that like feeling small is a reality check of, we get kind of caught up in our lives and in our day-to-day stuff, and it's good to have that experience of feeling small.
As you said earlier, so you create from photographs, but do you create from your own photographs, or is it just other people's photographs?
Well, at first it was from like anything and everything kind of.
Yeah.
Then I moved to working from other people's photographs, but asking them for permission. And now I'm mostly working from my own stuff, like from life, from imagination, and from photographs. But actually, in 2 weeks, I'm moving out of the city and into a more rural setting. So I think I'm going to be working more from life and from like my own imagery, or from like the view from my future studio.
That's amazing. Are you excited
Mm-hmm.
about it?
I'm so excited. Yeah, it's honestly hard to focus on anything else because it's in exactly 2 weeks today. So it's yeah, I'm very excited about it.
So I wanted to ask you, based on the idea of using photographs, and I don't think I put this question in the notes, so I apologize if it throws you.
No worries.
But what does a painting do that a photograph doesn't?
Well, I think we've moved away from the idea of a painting needing to represent something realistically. I think that's something that, the advent of photography liberated painting in a way, because it no longer had to serve the purpose of showing something realistically. So I think that painting now is just free to do whatever it wants. And so you can represent something very realistically, even in like a photorealistic manner if you choose. But you can also just go get really weird with it and do whatever you want, and it's fine. And so I think that paintings can give more of a emotional response to a thing instead of just like a physical reproduction of it as well.
See, that's a really great response to that question. Because when I ask a lot of people that question, they're a bit like, that's a really, really good answer, actually. And as somebody who does photography, I actually really appreciate that response. And I think it's actually it's very well considered, I must say. I'm actually very impressed with that response.
Nice. Well, even photography, I don't think has nowadays like that responsibility towards realism. Like I think
of course,
that
yeah.
there's a lot of abstract photography, or there's a lot of photography that's more atmospheric or more, looking to show a specific atmosphere, vibe, or whatever you want to call it, where it's not like just showing of a thing. It can be like very free as well.
Oh, absolutely. But that's just a good way of considering. Because I'm just always curious, like why you would paint an image when you have the photograph in front of you. That's why that's kind of where that question lies.
Yeah.
That's really.
Well, yeah, it's true. It's a good question because there's definitely a lot more time involved in creating a painting than in, clicking on a button in order to take a photo. Like I know it's more complicated than that
I know, of course, yeah.
For
but
photography. Yes. Of course, I don't mean to
oh no,
to downplay it, but
it's fun. But no,
so there's
absolutely
definitely more time that goes into creating it. So I think you have time to like reflect on why you're doing it as well while you're doing it, and to kind of like react to what's going on the canvas as well. So like even if you start out with a certain intention, it usually ends up veering from that as you're going through it. Like if you're responding to what's going on in front of you, and you're not like sticking to like a very strict plan and tight drawing from the beginning.
So what are your thoughts on gentrification and the idea of kind of like the way technology is impacting the landscape?
The way that technology is impacting the landscape. I don't know, like I think that it can create some visually interesting things for sure if you're using it in a certain way. Otherwise, I think it's just kind of become part of our visual library as well, because most people live in a city. Most people have access to nature through a more like urban environment. So I think that we have this way of seeing that is impacted by all that, and I think that also the fact that we can see it through lenses or through photography or through like the internet as well is going to impact the way that we see it and like what is made possible by it. The fact that we can digitally manipulate things afterwards as well, I think is also going to impact our relationship to images and how we view them and how we consume them and produce them. I'm less interested, I would say, in like that digital aspect of all those things, even though like I know that it's a very interesting area. Like it's just not something that for me is interesting in my practice, but I like what other people can do with it.
That's the thing that I feel like the great thing about art is everybody has their own lane, or at least, you can carve out a niche for yourself, or like, there'll be an area of art in which you are comfortable. And I think that's really fun. Like you don't have to explore the landscape through every single means possible, to say every single kind of avenue available. You can say, oh, I want to look at this topic, or I want to explore that topic, and that's perfectly fine. And I think that's the best thing, really.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of trying to say everything all at once through like all the different mediums that are available to you, because I think that can end up being more confusing as well. Like I think we definitely need to explore and find what we are interested in, but we don't have to do all of the things because there's someone else out there doing it too, and it's fine,
Are there actually any other mediums you'd like to explore?
I really like printmaking, actually. In art school, I had the opportunity to explore printmaking. So my favorite mediums in that are linocut printing and screen printing. I don't know if you're familiar with those mediums.
I am indeed.
Okay. So that's something I want to get into a bit more in the future as well, especially linocut, because there's I just like the material aspect of it too, where like you're physically carving something and creating an image out of like a 3D block that you're carving into. And I think the language of linocut is very interesting to me, like just the very contrasted kind of effects that you can get, or just the very I guess the limits of the medium are what make it nice as well, because you can't easily do like very fine lines or like very detailed things if you're using like bigger carving tools where like all of your carved lines will have a certain aesthetic quality to them as well.
Okay, so I actually want to spend a bit of time talking about, or at least briefly mention, I think it's definitely worth a mention, the idea of your custom image series and also your pixelated paintings that are actually really, really intriguing. Like where did the idea for like these bodies of work come about? Because they're not like fully fleshed bodies of work that you're necessarily going to exhibit, but they're also really, really great things to talk about independently because they're just so interesting as well.
I think it was just a reaction to trying to bring my sense of humor into painting as well, and not having it just be like, serious or having like a specific goal in mind. I can think a lot of the cursed images that I ended up painting were just things that I found funny and that I was looking for something to paint that day. So I painted this meme or this strange taxidermy animal that looks horrible, and that just made me laugh. And so that whole, I'm calling it a series, but it's, as you said, it's not cohesive. There's not like a specific like theme running through it, but other than the fact that they just made me laugh or that I wanted to paint them at the time. yeah, so I think it was just a way for me to have fun with it while still, painting and still doing something that day without having the pressure of like, oh, you must make serious art today.
Yeah.
So that was part of it, but also just kind of reflecting on how the internet affects the images that we consume or the images that we see, and how that can translate into even a very like serious medium as such as oil painting, and it
Yeah.
doesn't have to remain this like very traditional thing that you're not allowed to touch like any memes or any funny things or cursed images with.
Yeah, because especially like the Furbies, which are funny because it's very
Hmm.
nostalgic. 'Cause they're very much a throwback, and it's.
Yeah.
I saw them and I was like, these are absolutely great, and I sent some to my brother because I was like, he would love this. So it's kind of interesting
Hmm.
how you kind of tap into the whole idea of nostalgia or the idea of like kind of imagery that's more universal, but at the same time,
Hmm.
it's just like as you said, it's not super serious. It's not like, oh, these have to be perfect. It's a case of just
Hmm.
being like, it's
Yeah.
almost like practice, I guess, in a way.
Exactly. And like those first four Furbies that I painted, I did them in one day. It was
Wow.
sometime like early pandemic. And I was just working on four at the same time. And then I finished them. And I was talking to artist friends as well while painting. And then I I posted them, and I did not expect people to react to them or to like want them or anything. I just thought like,
Yeah.
this is going to go to the bottom of the drawer, and that's fine. And I had fun today, so it's cool. But I was surprised by how many people wanted them and contacted me and reacted to them, and were just like, I must have this Furby. This like reminds me so much of the Furby I had when I was growing up. And
Yeah.
then I had Furby commissions. Like I could be a full-time Furby painter if I wanted to, because I had so many requests for people who were like,
That's amazing.
please paint my Furby. And then I discovered that there was this whole community of people who, like, for example, I think, well, I now created a separate Instagram account where I post
Yeah.
these sorts of things just to kind of have like a more, like coherent thing. But that account is called Important Paintings, because I'm not being sarcastic at all.
Absolutely.
No, but yeah, so the amount of people that contacted me on that Instagram and were like, please paint my Furby and everything. And then I started realizing that like all of their Instagram handles were like, Furby this, Furby that, or like, I love my Furby, or whatever. So there's a lot of people, and I didn't know that this whole like community existed of people who still collect them or like who
Yeah.
modify them and have like personalized Furbies. And there's like so many of them.
Have you ever heard? I'm assuming you have nowadays, but have you ever heard of long Furbies?
Yeah.
Yes, I actually brought my brother one for his birthday because they're great. They're like the best. They're so funny. But yeah, it's like I can imagine that's actually a really funny idea. Actually, that the fact that see, actually, what I really love about that is that you just took something that you were just like, cool, I'll just paint this every day, not seriously at all, and it
Mhm.
could have became very much a very serious full-time business for you.
Exactly.
Like I feel like that's a good lesson for people to kind of remember. Like not everything you do has to be done with seriousness in mind when you start,
Mhm.
because you never know how it's going to develop when people see it.
Exactly. And I think in terms of like learning to paint, if you give yourself these moments of, I'm going to paint this like bad taxidermy fail that looks absolutely ridiculous, and that's what I'm going to do today, and it's fine. It doesn't have to be serious. And I think it also takes away some of that pressure of having to make a good painting that I think we feel when we're starting out, or when we want to learn, and when we want to kind of prove to ourselves that we can paint, or we want to go along that route. So yeah, I think allowing yourselves to just explore an idea and not having any expectations for it is very important as well, like regardless of where you are in the process, but especially at first, because I think there's a lot of pressure at first to like already know who you are as an artist and
Yeah.
to already do that. And I think that's ridiculous. Like you wouldn't, if you're learning an instrument, for example, if you're learning guitar, we're not going to give you a guitar and tell you like express yourself and like already show us who you are as a musician. It's just going to be like learn the basics, do some covers, like learn some theory, and like learn how to use your instrument.
Yeah.
And then eventually you're going to have a voice or a style, but it's not going to be right away. And there's not going to be that pressure of like you must know who you are as a musician right away. But I think that in visual art there is that sort of notion of you
Okay.
have to have your voice already, and like I think that's really absurd.
So you said earlier that obviously you're still very much in the process of learning and very much in the process of finding yourself. But like, do you feel like you have a style?
Maybe more and more, but I don't feel like, there's a lot of artists that I like or follow or admire who I don't have to see their name to know that they painted something, like I can right away tell that it's them. I personally don't feel that I have that yet. I still think that I'm figuring things out and like going more and more towards what I want. But I think a style doesn't necessarily just have to be like in the paint handling or in like how you handle your medium, but it can also be in the subject matter, the palette, or in what you have to say about it as well. So I think it's like a very it's more of a complex thing than just like stylistic choices or voices. But yeah, no, I don't think yet that I do, but hopefully soon.
Because I feel like there's always a pressure, and I know, as you've just commented on, there's always a pressure for an artist to have a style or to kind of, as you said earlier, like kind of know who they want to be as an artist. And I kind of feel like that, like many times, that becomes kind of like the undoing of an artist because they're
Mm-hmm.
so busy trying to find a style, or they're so busy focusing on style, they actually forego kind of like the deeper meanings of their work or what their work is about or why they're even creating in the first place. And I'm,
True.
I'm kind of actually curious, just in your own opinion of like your work so far, like how have you made sure that you're creating the work that you want to create as well as creating work that is going to sell? Because obviously
Mm-hmm.
commodification and business always also has to come into the mix because you want to make money.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I just want to say that style is also a matter of choice. So if, for example, I had realized that, the Furby paintings sell really well, and they do, I could have just decided to only do Furby paintings, and that could have been my, quote unquote style. But I think that for me, that wasn't, the route that I wanted to go. And it just felt like I had other things that I wanted to say that weren't this. So I think that it's partly the choices you make, but also like what we call style is just a kind of combination of the time that you spend developing something. It's also an expression of your taste. So depending on what you like, that's going to find its way into what you create. So taste isn't something that you can necessarily change all that much, because I think you have like a certain taste or something that you like in art that you will seek to express, like even unconsciously. But it's also yeah, like as I mentioned, the time that you spend doing it, and then what we call the talent, which is just eventually like over time you get better at your craft, and that becomes part of your style, or it can anyway. Or anyway, that's what I think about that.
That's a really good way of looking at it, actually. Because I just feel like I meet so many artists that just don't know who they are, and it impacts them in a way that they don't know what they're creating or why they're creating or what they
Mm-hmm.
should be creating. I
Yeah.
kind of do wonder, like, do you think it's important for an artist to know why they're creating the work they create, or do you think can you just get by without knowing that?
Well, I think that depends on what you want to accomplish with it. Like if you want to be a professional artist, then I think yes, you do need to eventually get to a point where you know what you want to express and why you're expressing it, and you have to be able to express it in a certain way. If you're doing this for fun or like as a cathartic thing that you do, then not necessarily. I mean, like just throwing paint around can be very, very cathartic, and you don't have to justify that. And I think it just, if it is a hobby for you, you don't have to monetize it. Like I hate this idea of having to monetize all of your hobbies, because it puts such a pressure on people, especially like beginner artists who are just starting to paint, and then their friends are telling them like, oh, you should sell your things, you should paint this, it sells, or you should do this. And I think that's a horrible way of approaching something that should otherwise be so freeing and so fun. And yeah, so I think that's a big part of it too. And you asked earlier about commodification, and I think that that's a part of it as well. Like not seeing your art as something that can be commodified right away, or like, or maybe one day it will be your job and you will have to commodify it in a way and sell it, but that shouldn't be your main starting point, especially if you're learning to paint. Like just learn to paint, have fun with it, and don't worry about painting as a product. Like just see it as a journey and as a thing that you're doing. And like you will create physical artwork, and then eventually you will have to find a way to like either paint over it, store it, throw it out, or sell it. But until then, just worry about like expressing things that you want and like learning, and it's fine.
I love that those are like the four options you have of what you're going to do with an image once it's complete.
Exactly. Or you could burn it. That's a fifth.
That's true. That's great. Right. I'm kind of curious. So, like, do you work in a studio?
Yeah, well, what you see behind me
Yes.
now is the corner of my studio, but it's a home studio, so it's just a room in my home where I paint from. But as I mentioned a bit earlier, I'm moving in 2 weeks, but I'm still going to have a home studio at that point. It's really nice to have it be at home, because it's so convenient. Like if I want to start working, or if I just want to, prepare a panel for the next day, I can just go in and like do a quick like 10-minute thing, and then it's done, and I don't have to commute or do anything like that. However, I'm kind of jealous of people who have these like big like dirty studios where they can get like paint all over the place and like just destroy the floors. And I don't have that currently, but in my next place, I'm thinking of maybe setting up a studio in the basement where I'll be able to do like very messy stuff, and then have another like painting area upstairs where I can, like look out the window and have fun and, do other things as well.
So that's a really good, as I've said about 1,000 times already, that's like a really good consideration because
Hmm.
the space in which you create really denotes the kind of work you create. And I
Hmm.
kind of feel like everybody always says they want more space, but I also feel like the fact that you have a home studio and you're using what you have says a lot
Hmm.
about your willingness as an artist to create work.
Hmm. True. Yeah. And also, I think, well, as I mentioned, like since I started painting more seriously during the pandemic, it just made sense to have a home studio, and I'm lucky enough to have a room that I can use just for that as well. So, it feels more serious when you can come into the studio and like close the door, and you don't like worry about bothering anyone, because my the apartment I was living in before this, when I started painting, was I had a corner of the living room, so it was like I live with my boyfriend and he works from home as well. So he had another corner of the living room where he was working. So we were kind of sharing that space and like, trying to respect each other's like boundaries and all that while working in the same room, and while, I was creating like toxic fumes and, and all these things that you really shouldn't be doing in your living room. But
Hey, he's dating an artist. What does he expect at the end of the day?
exactly.
That's the sacrifice relationship that is.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of curious because two artists I spoke to, basically very early on, just at some point in this journey of the podcast, one
Hmm.
called Ellis King, the other called Mark Thompson, both incredible artists. I'll send you their work.
Hmm.
But one thing they said about working in a studio or working in a studio environment is the idea of loneliness. And I'm kind of curious, like, do you ever get lonely whilst working in your studio? And if so, how do you combat that?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, when I was working towards my exhibition in the past couple of weeks, right before the deadline, I was definitely feeling lonely. And as much as I loved working on my projects, I had days where I was like, oh, I just want to go out and like see a human being, and
Yeah.
like I don't care which one. Um, so it kind of got to like a really really weird stage. I think like more if you're doing it in a more balanced way and you're not spending like 10 hours a day in the studio right before like a big crunch, it's generally fine, because you'll go out, you'll see friends, you'll like go for walks and see people, or spend time with your family and all that. And it's just that towards the end, I had that moment where like I really had to finish things, and I had a very specific deadline because my show got moved up a little bit. And I also had to make sure that my paintings were dry enough to be able to be transported to the gallery. So I
Yes.
had like to really finish things before a specific day, and I had like a timer where like I set my paintbrushes down at noon on a specific day, and that was like as far as I could go for them for the show. And yeah, so I felt like it was kind of alienating, but also kind of fun to like work in that like intensive environment, because I usually am a bit more relaxed about painting, where I'm not going to force myself to be all day in a studio if I'm feeling like I should be going outside that day, or I should be like doing other things. I'm going to like really listen to what I need in terms of like social interactions, but like also outdoor time, or whatever else. So I think it was fun to do that for a little while, but I couldn't do just that all the time in a very intensive way. And so I think
Yeah.
for me, the balance comes from like, having those moments where I do go outside, or like, even if I plan on painting that day, but I really feel like I don't want to, or like I want to see people, I'll listen to that.
So that's very important though, 'cause I feel like it's very easy to fall into the habit of creating because you have to create. When at the end of the
Hmm.
day, it's like you're right. Like if you don't want to create, you could very much waste a whole day trying to force yourself to create. And actually,
Hmm.
that's just not what you want to do. It's the same as like, I guess, being online. Like if you don't want to be online, just don't be online. Because otherwise, the things you're going to do online, you're just not going to do them well because you're not in the mindset or the mood to do it. So I think having that
Exactly.
self awareness and having that kind of the ability to be able to kind of control, like the self control, is I think that's actually a really good lesson for other people. Actually,
Hmm. True. And on those days where you're going to want to be in the studio alone, like nothing will be able to stop you. You're just going
yeah,
to be like really happy to be there and like really intense, and you're not at all going to miss people and all that. But in terms of loneliness, when I'm actually in the studio as well, I think what helps is just having like a variety of things that I listen to while I'm in the studio as well, like either music, like mostly music, but also shows, podcasts, movies, but like nothing in terms of like when there's visual images as well, nothing too interesting that I'm going to want to look at, but just like maybe a movie that I've seen a bunch of times that can just kind of be playing in the background while I do my thing.
Yeah. And do you ever feel like what you're listening to influences what you paint?
A little bit, like especially for music, if there's a very like upbeat kind of thing, I notice that I'm painting faster, or if it's like a little bit more mellow, then I'll kind of slow down a bit. But mostly what I find the interaction with music to be is that like, or not the interaction, but like the effect of it is that I'll be able to look at a painting of mine and like remember exactly what album I was listening to when I did a
Wow.
specific part. So that's really fun for me to be able to like remember those moments or like remember that thing like in relation to like a part of an image as well. It like
That's
becomes integrated to it.
That's fascinating because that's like the power of music. And I'm sure that's something I said in the last episode. I'm pretty sure it's the last episode. Um, might be the last episode, might be that's before. I can't remember. I talked to 200 people. But like the idea that music, like unlike art, music you take with you everywhere and you associate memories with music where you don't
Hmm.
necessarily do that with art. And I think that's kind of the power of music. Because I was
Hmm.
talking to, yes, the last person interviewed a really cool artist called Trails. I'm trying to remember, was it Trails? It was Trails. And we were talking about the idea of music. Yeah, because we're talking about music and listen to music.
Hmm.
And this idea that like how music is very different to art. In the sense of like, yeah, you can take it with you and you form memories, whereas an art itself is almost the, as you said, like the memory of that time. Like that's really
Hmm.
interesting how art can be a passageway into a moment of time for you as the
That's true.
artist, not just the
Hmm.
viewer.
Hmm. True. And like for sure, that's not going to translate to someone who sees my painting. They're not going to be like, "Oh, you're listening to that album in this
Yeah.
particular corner of this painting." But it'll probably impact the way that I painted that day for sure. And yeah, like I think that it will kind of tap into that same like emotional resonance that music can get into, or like the kind of nostalgic effect, or the like like bringing up old memories kind of thing, but just in a very different way. But I think maybe music is taps into those things a little bit easier than visual arts do, but I'm not sure.
See, that's really fascinating. I kind of feel like I should ask artists, like, if your images were, if you were to describe your image as an album, what album would you describe them as?
Mm.
What would be
Hmm.
your answer to that?
Oh my God. I'd have to think about that. I can't.
I feel like that would be such a good question to ask somebody. That'd be really
Yeah.
interesting. I'm going to write that down, even though it's
Hmm.
recorded. I'm going to write it down.
Yeah.
Music
I
as.
will get back to you on that though, but
Oh, no,
like,
please do. I'm actually really
hmm.
curious about that because I feel like
Hmm.
everybody, like when you, no matter what you create, you're always
Hmm.
listening to something, or there's always some background noise to what you're creating, even that's just like the environment around you.
Hmm.
Um, and like that will impact the way in which you feel and the way which will impact the way in which you create. And actually, like, do you do a lot of? I'm sure, of course, it's like plein air images, or do you ever go out
Hmm.
into the actual environment and paint?
Well, living in a city currently, I don't do a lot of that. Like I mostly like go for walks and take photos kind of
Mm.
thing. But where I'll be moving to, I
Yeah, of
think I
course.
really am excited about doing a lot of plein air painting, or at least being very inspired by like those moments or like those areas where I'll be outside. Yeah, or like just having in my next place, I'll have like a yard and a garden and all these things. So I think that I'll be so excited to be painting there and or to just like incorporate that into what I'm doing. And yeah, so I don't know if I've told you a little bit about like where I'll be moving, but it's not super far from the city. Like it's still accessible to come back here, but it's in a very rural environment. Like my close neighbors are like just small farms and
Wow,
horses and
that's
mountains and
that sounds very idyllic, and that sounds like kind of
Mhm.
like for you and your work, especially like the kind of right
Mhm.
environment for you to be creating in. I think it's going to hugely positively impact your work and the way in which you create. I think it's going to be like one of the best changes you could probably make for yourself. That concludes the first part of my conversation with Crystel Pereira. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about it, please send me an email at theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com via social media sites such as Instagram and Twitter. The Flying Fruit Bowl podcast can now be found on a variety of sites such as Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music. Please consider rating, reviewing, sharing, or subscribing on any of these platforms to help us spread the word. Also, please don't forget to check out theflyingfruitbowl.co.uk for daily art inspiration, and if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. We now also have a Patreon page if you're interested in supporting the platform further. Tiers start from £1, and more information can be found over at patreon.com/theflyingfruitbowl. If limited donations are not something you're interested in, we now also have a PayPal for one-time donations. I shall leave a link to our PayPal in the show notes below. Once again, thank you very much for listening to this episode today. And until next time, folks, please stay safe.